There we go again.
So the transcript begins.
Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Mike Lynn. I'm the interim chair of the Department of History, Politics, Economics, and Philosophy. I'm pleased today to introduce our speakers, but before we do that, I want to make one or two short announcements of upcoming events. First of all, tomorrow we have a philosophy matters discussion with David Detmer. He'll be talking about the problem of tolerance. That's at 5 p.m. at Hammond and on Zoom. Later this week, we have the National Philosophical Counseling Association holding its virtual conference. If you're interested in such things, please contact Professor Sam Zaniach. And next month, we have our speaker for History Matters, Mary Beth Frazier Connolly. We're talking about bringing mercy to the world, the Sisters of Mercy's missionary experience in the United States and Peru. Today, we have a talk titled "That Time Americans Wanted a Monarchy," featuring our guest speaker, Michael Connolly, and in conversation with John Swarts. Some brief background on them. John Swarts is professor of political science and dean of the Honors College and undergraduate UW. His scholarly interests include politics of advanced industrial democracies. He's written a book, Constructing Neoliberalism, Economic Transformations in Anglo-American Democracies, and has co-authored a book, American Foreign Policy Toward the Colonel's Greece, about the 1967 coup in the country. Michael Connolly is professor of history, earned his PhD from the Catholic University of America. I should point out that Dr. Swarts earned his PhD from The Ohio State University. Both of them are very keen on their definite articles. You have to V in front of those things. He has been with Purdue since since 2004, and he's written two books. One, Capitalism, Politics, and Railroads in Jacksonian New England, came out in 2003, and his latest endeavor, Jacobitism in Britain and the United States, 1880 to 1910. Please join me in welcoming Michael Connolly and Dr. Swarts.
Thank you, Dr. Lynn.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Lynn. So let's jump right into it with the History Matters, since we're doing definite articles now. So I know you won't be offended when I say that Jacobitism probably doesn't roll off most people's tongues and probably didn't see it on the evening news last night. So
They will shortly. I'm coming back.
So what is it? What's the main focus of your book?
So Jacobitism, people, I think we look at the word Jacobitism and get it maybe confused with Jacobin. You heard Jacobin before? Professor Dusan Cavey certainly has. It's too close. Okay. Hopefully that's that better. Should I just pull it on? So there's a difference between Jacobite and Jacobin. Jacobin is a French revolutionary. As I say in the book, someone who has a volume of Rousseau in one hand and the cord of the guillotine in the other, their red caps. A Jacobite is an adherent to and a supporter of the Stuart monarchy and the restoration of the Stuart monarchy. So James in Latin is Jacobus. So Jacobite means a follower of James. And the James that we're referring to here is James II of England, who in 1688 was thrown off the throne in the so-called Glorious Revolution. Of course, Jacobites wouldn't call it a glorious revolution, it'd be an inglorious revolution to them. Jacobites throughout the 18th century are attempting to restore the Stuarts to the throne, and periodically will actually try to do so violently. You have rebellions in 1715 and the big one in 1745, the Rising, which very nearly succeeded. Charles Edward Stuart, who was the grandson of James II, Bonnie Prince Charlie, as it was called, came quite close to London, almost succeeded, but eventually was defeated. Battle of Culloden. And at that point, Jacobitism begins to fade out and slowly recede as a political force, certainly as a violent political force. And it becomes sort of the stuff of literature. Walter Scott novels. Isn't it the Waverley novels? I think something to do with the Jacobite theme. And then all of a sudden in the 1880s, right? So we're now getting to the late Victorian period. Queen Victoria is getting quite old, been on the throne since the 1830s. Beginning in the middle of the 1880s, there is this resurgent Jacobitism, rather all of a sudden. And its focus isn't, again, on violent rebellion. There's not an army march in Britain trying to, take Victoria off the throne. That would be something. It's a much more different focus. This version of Jacobitism is a reform movement in an era that's proliferating with reform movements, right? Both sides of the Atlantic, UK and the US, right? So the late 19th century, what do you often think of? You think of a rising progressivism, late 19th century, early 20th, progressivism, populism, socialism, rising interest in Marxism, certainly, even more violent forms of nihilism, anarchism, and the like. And what are they doing? They're lashing out against what they see as a world gone wrong by the late 19th century, politically gone wrong, because politics has become sort of corrupt and dominated by interests, economically gone wrong, because the Industrial Revolution and the factory system, this is the Jacobites talking and many reform movements talking now, it gets you to a point where major cities are suffering from health problems, overcrowding, they're miserable places to be, workers are suffering terrible conditions, and the like. But these Jacobites begin speaking to those concerns, just like you'd hear a progressive or a socialist say. Now, their solutions are going to be radically different from a completely different direction. So this new resurgent Jacobitism, still interested in putting the Stuarts back on the throne. When Victoria dies and she's getting old, they want a Stuart to come back. They think the world will be put right if that happens. But their concerns are much more varied. This is a reform movement, so much so that many historians will say they're neo-Jacobites, in that there's just something slightly different about what they're trying to do.
Can you explain just very briefly from a historical point of view, why was there this kind of interruption at the end of those four Stuart kings of the 17th century? Why was there this interruption that moved over to the current, basically the current line, with think of King Charles III now is a descendant of the Hanoverians.
Right.
What was the religious context that gave rise to this? Because ultimately it was a religious conflict that led to
In 1688.
the execution of Charles I, the Glorious Revolution of 1688.
Right. So you can go further back. If you go into the 17th century, you have the English Civil War, this collision between Anglican, and some people would say that Charles I was actually a secret Catholic, his wife was, between the Stuarts and the Puritans in the English Civil War, obviously very violent, disorderly period, ending in 1649 with the execution, the beheading of Charles I, and then the Cromwellian interregnum, the Puritans taking over, and then 1660, the Stuarts coming back. And some would argue that the Glorious Revolution of 1688 was actually a religious revolution as well, because Charles was a Catholic. He had a child, had a male son. Of course, that freaked all kinds of people out because they thought, now this is going to institutionalize the return of Catholicism to Britain, almost rolling back the English Reformation. So there is a religious aspect to the a heavy religious aspect to the Glorious Revolution. And of course, you get the Hanoverians after that, who Jacobites, beginning with William and Mary, down to today, Charles III, not the legitimate monarchs of Great Britain.
Right.
These are, as far as a Jacobite was concerned,
Even though they are descendants of the Stuarts, kind of collaterally.
Right, because Mary was William and Mary was in fact a Stuart.
Right.
Yes, but the process was wrongly done, if you will. James was forced off of the throne, which marks every British monarch after that is illegitimate. Not having, in some senses, the Glorious Revolution is a violation of nature because of the succession was broken up, which means every British monarch from that point to today is in fact a de facto monarch. They have the throne by the mere fact that they're sitting on the throne,
Right.
but it's not legitimately theirs.
So by the time we get to the late 19th century, and you go into great detail about this in the book, so I wonder if you could explain it for us a little bit here. How, several hundred years later, late 19th century, as you said, in the midst of great social and economic turmoil in Europe and here in America, you have this kind of resurgence of this Jacobite view of the world. And you talk about three concepts in the book: their view of authority, their view of liberty, and their view of democracy. Can you explain what their view of those is? Because it's very different from the liberal individualistic view that we see really kind of taking rise. And of course, it's completely different than the Marxist or socialist view you see.
Certainly, it'd be different than we would consider much of it today.
Right,
At least some
right.
people would consider it today.
Right.
So first, authority. This is a Jacobite talking. There's a difference between authority and power. Authority carries with it legitimacy, just like I was speaking of before. Legitimate succession. You're holding it. You're holding it through some permission, if you will. Some Jacobites are divine right theorists, so the authority comes rightfully from God. But authority loses all of its luster, its legitimacy, if it is taken violently, if the succession is interrupted, if it's seen as not being delivered from God, if rightful kingship is interrupted. That's not authority after that. That's the wielding of power. And there's a difference between the two of them for a Jacobite. So all monarchs after the deposition of James are people who exercise power rather than having legitimate authority. And for Jacobites, if you want to know why the world is going to hell by the end of the 19th century, is because of the absence of legitimate authority.
Which ultimately has the divine origin in their view.
It does, although it should be emphasized, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, that not all Jacobites were divine right adherents. So don't go too deep into the weeds, but Robert Filmer, Patriarcha, a very famous divine right theorist in the 17th century, is the sort of poster philosopher for divine right theory. That kings hold authority descended from Adam, right? It's the sort of God-given patriarchal authority coming all the way down to him. Very biblical sense of that. Not all Jacobites buy that theory. There are some, and this is one of the things I found really interesting while looking at these Jacobites. Some of them have a real affection for Thomas Hobbes, of all people. Thomas Hobbes is a social contract thinker, but they like somebody like Thomas Hobbes because they look at their own time, 1890s. What do they see? Disorder. They see disorder, political disorder in a parliament, corrupt and what have you, dominated by interest. Everything I said before, the economics of the time are a mess as well. They see disorder, and Hobbes appeals to them. Leviathan, his famous book, appeals to them because Hobbes wrote that in a time of disorder, coming out of the English Civil War. And they look at their own time, and they look at the 17th century when Hobbes is writing, and they see similarities. So Hobbes is in fact a good backdrop for becoming a Jacobite. Why are we Jacobites? Because we live in a disorderly time that needs to be put right again. One of the problems is the interruption of rightful kingship and so on. On liberty, Jacobites have a very different conception of what liberty means. In our own time, we might define, most people, I think, at least Americans, would define liberty as doing as one likes, a sort of individualism,
freedom,
right? A sort of possessive individualism. There's economic rights that are involved in that. Is not what Jacobites are talking about when it comes to liberty. Liberty is sort of having the freedom to discover what is right and true and good, and then being able to do it, if you understand what I mean.
The freedom to live a virtuous life then.
The freedom to live a virtuous life, to discover what virtue is, not discover what virtue is for yourself,
Right.
but discover what capital V virtue is, and we give you the room to discover what it is. That's what rights really mean. The right to not do whatever you want, but a right to discover what is good and true and then live it. So an entirely different understanding of liberty. And then finally, democracy. To put it frankly, they do not like democracy whatsoever. They think it's a promise that has never been fulfilled. Across the 19th century, and even before that, the promise of democracy is if you let more people into the system, if you will, you have an inclusive political system where more and more people are brought into it, participating as voters and what have you, you'll get a higher quality political system. You'll get better output, if you will.
Mhm.
And the Jacobites say, well, if you look across the term of the 19th century, we have an awful lot of increase in quantity, but a perceptible decrease in quality. You're not getting a better product, if you will. What in fact you are getting is the rise of oligarchs and business interests and demagogues. So the promise of democracy has not been fulfilled by late Victorian America. And we ought to take notice of that and perhaps pursue other options, which is an empowered monarchy is what they're really looking for.
Well, that's a great segue into what I was going to ask next, which is, especially in the context of the United States in the late 19th century. Can you explain a little bit the logic of the Jacobites? Why would monarchy, of all things, be seen as the cure to modern ills? You can imagine other political structures, other polities that might cure the ills of the modern world. Why monarchy? And why the Stuart kings? What's the connection?
Did you begin at saying in particular reference to the United States?
Especially in the United States. So what's the, so it's a kind of a combined question there. What's the appeal to Americans of the Stuart kings? And why is monarchy seen as being a potential cure to the ills of the modern world? Because you can imagine a conservatism that's a Republican conservative, small r, that's not monarchical. There've been lots of, there would be lots of philosophers they could point to. There'd be lots of, theory they could point to. You didn't have to have a monarchy. So why, especially in the American context, in a republic, why the Stuart kings and why the whole concept of monarchy as being the cure to modern problems?
We should put an asterisk next to the American Jacobites, because if you're in England, and all the things I've already mentioned, all the corruption, the terrible things that are going on at the end of the 19th century, and you say, well, Parliament's all at fault, they're riddled with corruption and interests and the like, and what we need is a more powerful monarchy after Victoria, much more empowered Stuart monarchy or something like that. You could find plenty of people in England who would probably agree with you. Not a lot, but I mean, you'd find some people who would not. If you say that in America, if you go to an average American in the 1890s, say, hey, what this country needs is a monarchy, most Americans are going to say, well, that's your crank. That's a strange thing to say. So American Jacobites don't tend to make that case quite as strong. So the most famous of the there's two great American Jacobites, but probably the most famous of the two is a man named Ralph Adams Cram. Ralph Adams Cram was an architect by trade, very famous architect, arguably one of the most famous architects the first half of the 20th century in the United States. Mm-hmm. And Cram is from an old Federalist family in New England. And he's making all the same observations of the problems in the United States, just the same type of observations, see problems in Great Britain, corruption and everything like that. But he can hardly come out and say, yeah, we need a king or queen here. You have to speak more to the context of the United States. So the answer isn't necessarily a king or queen. The answer is a more powerful presidency, an American presidency that looks more like a monarchy. Now, where can you find that in the American tradition? For Cram, again, good old Federalist. Look at his name, by the way, Ralph Adams Cram. His father was a Unitarian minister from, again, an old Federalist Whig family. Ralph Waldo Emerson, his father was a big fan of Emerson. Adams, loved the Adams family, John Quincy Adams, again, old Federalist. For Cram, his favorite person in the American tradition, and he's trying to bring his philosophy back, if you will, is Alexander Hamilton. And of course, Hamilton is the philosopher of a powerful presidency. He's the one making the argument in Philadelphia for longer terms of office and a much stronger executive and elected presidency. So for American Jacobites like Cram, they're going to be saying things like, well, 4 years for a presidential term, too short. Not enough time to get things done. Make it 20. Right? You make it more. How about an absolute veto? Right? None of the Congress being able to overturn. No. How about an absolute veto? How about we take the Senate and make it look more like the House of Lords? Make it lifetime. Give it a little bit more power, so that the working within the confines of the American constitutional system, a few amendments here or there. You turn it into a more British-like system, but the key here being a more powerful elective presidency. So you get a king, kind of. You get a sort of an American version of a king. That's how they do it. That's how they argue it.
Did they have, I mean, clearly the political program, it went nowhere. And you detail this in the book and how it really fizzled out fairly quickly in historical terms.
The American version of it will disappear 20 years at the absolute extent, the widest extent of it. It's probably more like 15.
But there must have been other conservatives, not of the Jacobite variety, but there must have been other conservatives that with whom they could have made common cause or not. There must, I mean, we've talked a little bit about how there were other critics of the modern industrial, increasingly democratic society that the United States was becoming. So there must have been others out there who were making maybe not the same critique, but a similar critique, especially when it came to industrialization and democracy. And
it would have thrown them into the company of people that they would have not felt comfortable. And that would have been thrown them into the company of probably people in the Jeffersonian tradition, the Jeffersonian agrarian tradition. Cram could not stand Jefferson. Gallo-maniacal Jefferson, he called him. A little too French, a little bit too close to the French Revolution, not comfortable with those types of people. He was a Hamiltonian through and through. So while, yes, as you say, there are people like populists and progressives and things like that, people who are mocking is not the right word, who are very concerned about and wanted to alter and reform the political and economic system that's going on, that would have put them into the company of people they would not have liked, these Jeffersonians. And the Republican Party at the time is very much on the side of the things, it is very much on the side of industrial growth. As I tell students in class, Republican Party means smokestacks and railroads. They're interested in promoting the industrial system and developing. Not going to be particularly happy with many people in the Republican Party, and of course the Democratic Party is going to be too Jeffersonian for them, and arguing for a weaker presidency. They're not going to find home there.
I was thinking, and it kind of ties into my next question a little bit, of how you focus primarily on New England and New England Jacobites. Were there Jacobites in other parts of the country? I mean, you think the South, you think of the Scots-Irish influence in the South, you think of, there was a conservative critique. Of course, it manifested itself in some respects, for example, in the Klan in a completely different way, but which interestingly has its weird Scottish, kind of ethnic connection. Was there Jacbotism in the South, in the Midwest, and other parts of the country? It
does not seem to have taken hold any place but northeastern cities, and I'm sort of stretching it to include Philadelphia in that. It seems to have been strongest there. Certainly got notice in other places. Does not seem to have taken hold in places like the U.S. South. And the famous Jacobite magazine in Britain at the time was the Royalist, and the Royalist is very much interested in the United States and is like, oh, look, there's a Jacobite movement beginning in the United States. Isn't this fantastic? They're very excited by that. And they'll note things like, well, of course there's a Jacobite movement there because all these Jacobites after 1745 fled to North Carolina, right? And eventually some of them fought in the Revolution. Of course, it's a natural Jacobite place, but it doesn't seem to have taken root there. It took root in particular places like Boston and New York, to a degree in Philadelphia, in Episcopalian areas, Episcopalian parishes. One of the primary factions within Jacobitism on both sides of the Atlantic are particularly Anglo-Catholic parishes, clerics, some Roman Catholics as well. You don't find it much in the Midwest either. Excuse me, although one prominent Jacobite, the Marquis de Ruvigny, who's a major player in this book, came to the United States and traveled to the Chicago World's Fair, observed it and what have you, and was here in the United States to promote the development of societies, but one does not seem to have taken root that I could find in Chicago. It took root in places like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, which is one of the odd things, of course, is one of these Jacobite parishes, which hangs a portrait of King Charles I, a life-size portrait of King Charles I. One of these parishes is in Philadelphia, blocks from Independence Hall. Church of the Evangelists in Philadelphia with a 6-foot portrait that they commissioned, had it shipped over from England, hung it in the Church of the Evangelist in Philadelphia. It's like 8 to 10 blocks from Independence Hall. You can imagine what the public reaction was when they held a ceremony to, unveil this, pull the curtain and, here's King Charles, and have the newspapers, the secular as well as the religious press blew up. This is un-American. Why in the world are you celebrating? How could any American celebrate King Charles I? He's an absolutist. He's everything that the American Revolution was supposed to be against. Got a little bit of attention.
But they did have an explanation for that, if I remember right.
Sure.
Didn't they say that they tried to draw a connection that some of the colonial charters had been issued
Absolutely.
by
Yeah.
Charles? And so, well, there's our connection.
That's right.
It was all, we're patriots in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Charles I is an American founding father. Right? Because he, not only Charles I, but all of the Stuarts, we
Right.
should say, are American founding fathers. You don't have Virginia without them. You don't have Maryland. Even Puritans who founded New England, of course, hated Charles. How else do you get those, eventually those royal charters? They come from Stuarts. You should be thanking the Stuarts for everything instead of being ingrates. So that's the sort of entry point into saying, hey, you Americans, you should be Jacobites, because there wouldn't be an America without the Stuart kings. And it's fascinating to see in it the Episcopal Bishop of Iowa and Delaware standing up there in this Philadelphia church at the unveiling of this Charles I portrait, saying, Charles, isn't it great? Charles I, he's one of us. He's one of the founders of America. Very peculiar. And of course, as I said, it blew up in the press that something like this was happening.
Do we know what happened to that portrait?
Tried to track that down. It seems to have disappeared, or somewhere in the United States, in a very big house with that portrait, someone has it and has no idea what it is or where it came from. But there's a big portrait of
It's
Charles
hanging
I.
in someone who's a crypto Jacobite. It's hanging in their front parlor.
In a den with
In a big
curtains
parlor,
closed
right.
or something like that. Yes, right.
Well, we're kind of joking about it,
Yeah.
but you do talk about in the book the importance for a brief period of time where the Jacobites would lay wreaths at statues, both in Britain and you mentioned the example of Philadelphia here, special days of commemoration, especially on the day of the martyrdom of Charles I. Can you talk a little bit about that? And, of course, I was thinking it as I was reading, and then you mentioned it in the book as well, that it does have kind of a tie-in to kind of modern day issues and questions of memorialization, commemoration. What does memory mean? I mean, clearly the Jacobites saw a power in these statues, in this portrait, in having these memorials, of laying wreaths on these almost holy days. Can you talk about that and even comment on kind of how we understand memorialization today?
Yeah, it struck me when doing the research on this a few years ago that all this controversy about statues, right? Statues, Civil War statues, things like that, but it goes beyond just that as well. That there's a sort of a similarity between us and them, if you will, in that they understood that memorialization of the past held tremendous power. That statues and the memorialization that goes along with it is a type of historiography, not to get too deep into the weeds here. But that what and how you memorialize someone has an impact on the public consciousness on how they look at the past. One of the things that's going to annoy the Jacobites is that they think history has not only been unfair to the Stuarts, but has been written wrong, if you will, written incorrectly. That they have this, the celebration of 1688. They think that narrative is completely wrong. And one of the things they're trying to do, many of the Jacobites are trying to do in their magazines and things like that, is to rewrite the history, is to pose a different narrative of the times. And one of the ways to begin doing that is not just to sit down and write, but it is to call attention to these statues, begin to memorialize them, try to bring Charles I in Trafalgar Square and James II at Whitehall, bring them back into public consciousness. How do you do this? You process to them. You hold a mass for James II and then process to his statue and put flowers upon it and public prayers and have speeches being given. You do this quite repeatedly to almost force these issues back into into the public consciousness. They understood that memory was really powerful, and they wanted to shift the narrative and rewrite the narrative of English history, British history from 1688. And just looking back for a quick second, that's one of the problems that the American Jacobites faced, because they very soon realized that it's really difficult to do that in the US. Where's the statue of James II or
Right.
Charles I? There's certainly not one in Boston. I can tell you that. You know, there's no physical thing to go to and point to, put flowers under prayer, something like that. So what do? They have a fundraising campaign to have a giant portrait of Charles I painted and bring that over. So now we have something to venerate.
And can you talk a little bit about how, I mean, it's interesting how you mentioned how powerful these symbols were, especially in, for example, statues in Britain, and the laying of wreaths. The power of it was also recognized by the state, who was trying to prevent them from doing this. Can you talk a
Yes.
little about that?
You know, it's funny. You wouldn't think that the Queen Victoria, but the British government in general would look at this and feel terribly threatened.
Right.
Because it should be said right off the top, the Jacobite movement wasn't 1 million strong. This isn't a massive public movement with marching in the streets. We want, Jacobites. This is an elite movement. At its height, probably a few thousand people on both sides of the Atlantic, but they're very well placed people. The power of that movement comes from the fact that these are very well positioned Anglo-Catholic.
And philosophically, they wouldn't be interested in being a mass movement anyway, right?
No, it's not. Of course not. Democracy. We want to do that type of thing. No, this is very much of an elite movement. But the British government was annoyed by it. Very famously, I say very famously, but it's a great moment that in 1889 in London, they held the Stuart exhibition, which was funded by, I believe, the royal family. And it was a public display of Stuart items, physical things. And it was an enormous success, made money, actually. And Victoria actually would have gone to it, but a family member died and she couldn't go. But what was peculiar about it, and it was organized by the Jacobites, and the two main organizers were Jacobite. And what they did, they had the portraits of the major Stuarts there, and the kings as well, and those who were Stuart after 1688. But what they did is they gave the post 1688 Stuarts their legitimate titles.
The pretenders.
The pretenders.
Right.
So, it's James III and Charles III. So the
As
current
opposed to the current Charles.
Charles III, no, the original Charles III is Bonnie Prince Charlie, Charles Edward Stuart, and Henry the Ninth. And so
How
many.
did this slip past the authorities in putting together this exhibition?
It was done by the British Museum. Henry Jenner was a Jacobite. He was this great organizer of British expeditions and things like
So
that.
he was in a position to do
Yeah,
this.
he was a member of the Order of the White Rose. He was a Jacobite. So they went, they put all these things up, and people are coming in going, Henry the Ninth. I thought we knew our monarch. Who the heck is Henry the Ninth? And then they realized that these were the Jacobite titles. And Victoria apparently got quite upset at this.
Naturally.
And Henry Jenner was in her presence at one point, and I guess was introduced to her, and she turned her back on him and said, I have heard of Mr. Jenner. And just didn't want anything to do with them. They were actually annoyed, and it became an issue in Parliament because there was a raising of a Cromwell statue in 1900, right around there. And it was spoken of there, and the London authorities would refuse permission to the Jacobites to, hold these ceremonies and lay wreaths on Charles I or James II. So they were annoyed by it. It became a political issue.
Right. Well, probably from our perspective here in the 21st century, it all seems like, so much silliness. What does it matter? But by putting those titles on the Stuart kings, pretenders, it's a direct challenge to the authority of Queen Victoria and not only to her as a person, but to her entire line.
She's not legitimate.
She's not legitimate.
She holds the throne by a sort of inherited squatters' rights. That's what the Jacobites would have said. In fact, one of the famous Scottish Jacobites, Theodore Napier, was this ferocious Scots nationalist, would call her the Dowager Princess of Saxe-Gotha or something like that. Gave her the German title, wouldn't call her Queen
her
Victoria.
ancestral.
Yeah,
her ancestral
right.
home.
Yeah.
Let me ask you.
Let me say one thing quick about that,
yeah.
because it comes to mind because of these alternate titles. there was the Marquis de Ruvigny was excellent at this. They created this counterfactual history. This really interesting counterfactual history of how the world should have looked after 1688, had the detour of the Glorious Revolution never happened. So the Marquis de Ruvigny wrote two books. One, it's a small book called The Legitimist Calendar, which was a book of a calendar of the year, where if you were a determined Jacobite, every day of the year you could open up this calendar and famous Jacobite birthdays and events. No monarch after 1688, birth, death, nothing, or their progeny were listed in the Legitimist calendar, ignored. So it was as if 1688 and everything thereafter did not happen. And all of the pretenders' birthdays, they were listed there. It's just like a completely ignored British history after 1688. He also wrote a book called Jacobite Peerage, which again stops in 1688 and says all the titles granted by monarchs after 1688 are illegitimate. So all those peerages didn't happen. What would the world look like? Who were their descendants? So you have all of these really strange historical peculiarities, including many Americans who in the Jacobite peerage would have titles.
Mhm.
One of whom was, if you know your American history, John O'Sullivan. John O'Sullivan was one of the most famous Jacksonian Democrats of the 19th century. He was the man who came up with the phrase manifest destiny. You can't get more Jacksonian Democrat, by the way, anti-royalist.
Mhm.
He actually, his title should be Sir John O'Sullivan, because I believe his grandfather fought with the Bonnie Prince. It's this bizarre counterfactual history of how the world would have and should look like had 1688 never happened. They were champions of this.
That's a great segue to the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is this whole idea of legitimacy. And as I was reading, I was thinking about, okay, even if you're a convinced Jacobite, you believe in the legitimacy of monarchs and it's the importance of maintaining the proper succession from one legitimate monarch to another, et cetera, as we've talked about. I'm just curious from your perspective, especially as a historian. I mean, it strikes me that legitimacy is something that you don't want to press too far from a historical point of view, because the farther back you go, at some point, whether it's illegitimacy or somebody usurping the throne from someone else, how far back can you really go? Can you go back to Adam with all of this? I mean, and we know from a historical point of view that at some point, weird things happen and legitimacy takes detours in every royal house. I would think probably around the world, certainly in Europe, you could probably identify. I mean, even with the case of both the English and the Scottish thrones. I mean, do either one of them really go back before the Norman conquest? I mean, so at some point, where does legitimacy start, and how much can you really press that concept as a historical phenomenon?
And it was a criticism of them at the time.
Were they conscious of this problem?
Not particularly. No, it's not something they addressed or they felt necessary to address, but they were criticized for it, mocked for it would be a better way, because you have some critics saying, well, then obviously the Greeks should be in charge of Constantinople, because if you go back far enough, it's at a certain point it becomes a sort of silliness of infinite regression.
Exactly.
And it was one of the criticisms of legitimacy, which, to bring back to another point that I've made, which is why many Jacobites, in talking of legitimacy, fell back upon someone like Hobbes, because legitimacy is the maintenance of order. And if you can maintain order, because as far as they're concerned, the late 19th century is a time of disorder. If you can maintain order, it is a sign of legitimacy. That's where why I was saying earlier, they're not all divine right theorists. Legitimacy can come from many different directions. Yeah.
We're getting close to about quarter of the hour, so I want to leave time for questions from others. But so maybe I'll just end my questions with this. We've touched on this already, and you certainly talk quite a bit about it in the book. It seems like and to get back to the American context in particular, that the Jacobites were really fighting an impossible, not only from a political point of view, but ideological point of view. So can you address this question that everything they're arguing seems to be contrary to really the dominant thrust of all of American history, especially this liberal individualistic aspect to American society. This Hart's interpretation that the U.S. is, to its core, a liberal country, a small L liberal, classically liberal country with classically liberal values of individual freedom. How do you assess that? Because at the end of the book, you kind of say, well, this shows, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting what you said, but this shows that we're not all 100% classical liberals, that there are streams of alternatives. But doesn't to play devil's advocate, doesn't the Jacobite experience in their ultimate failure kind of prove the point that they were trying to essentially sow a completely alien ideology in soil that just was never going to take, given the deep classically liberal roots of American society?
Yeah. Let's take that in reverse. What interested me, I say it at the beginning of the book too, is that they are an example of an anti-liberal strain in American history. And famously, Louis Hartz wrote a book, 70 years ago, Liberal Tradition in America, where he sort of regretted the fact that the United States was entirely a liberal nation. We have left liberals and we have right liberals. Left liberals lean a little bit more towards the state. Right liberals lean a little bit more towards the market. But ultimately, at heart, they're all liberals and explain themselves as supporting individualism and things like that. And because of that, this was the import of Hart's thesis. This is why you don't have a large-scale socialist movement in the United States. Right. And secondarily, he was less concerned about this. I think Hart was actually sort of bemoaning the fact that there wasn't a larger socialist movement in the United States. The other side of that is this is also why you don't have a European-style traditional conservatism in the country. Instead, you have a sort of left liberal conservatism, if you understand what I mean. And what I wanted to do, and it's other things that I've worked on, is to the left side of that thesis has been dealt with a lot by historians in saying, well, it might not have the name socialism, but if you look in the 19th century, you'll see communities of barter and exchange, and it's not market oriented. It's much more of a communitarian vision, which they would call sort of socialistic vision. You don't see market priorities driving Americans in the 18th and 19th century. And this is an example that Hart is in fact wrong. Those American farmers or what have you were not really liberals in the American tradition. Right. So that's been dealt with by a lot of historians. The right side hasn't been dealt with. And what I was curious, and I've done several things on this, is to show that there are exceptions on the right as well. Jacobites being, American Jacobites being an example of this, that you do see periodically popping up personalities as well as movements which are anti-liberal. And there's nothing un-American about them. They're speaking the language of American political philosophy, social and economic philosophy, Cram being a perfect example. This is getting more American than Cram. Family going back for generations, what have you, this old Federalist family and what have you. So there is, it's me sort of trying to chip away a little bit at Hart's thesis from the other direction, that you do find these anti-liberal, and what, you know, nowadays there's a lot of conversation about about post-liberalism, that, yeah, maybe the United States had a very liberal period, but we're now beginning to get past it in some ways, as people complain about globalization, as people complain about, DeIndustrialization, all the things that we've heard about for the past 10 years, and the rise of populism and things like that. And in a small way, because I don't want to push this too hard and make it a commentary on contemporary politics, but what I'm trying to do in a small way is to show with something like Jacobites, you do see examples of anti-liberalism throughout American history. There is precedent for it. So the populism that in many ways is rising right now is not a phenomenon without roots. It's a phenomenon with precedents previous, if you understand what I'm trying to say.
I think it'll be interesting to see, and this as a political scientist, I think of it in terms of, if you look at today's kind of political spectrum, left to right, and the reason I ask this is because when I would teach American politics, I would kind of always make the argument, and I stand to be corrected, and we're going to think about it a little more deeply now. make the argument that we're all basically classical liberals in this country, and that,
Right.
you know, there's left liberals and right liberals, but basically at its core, the only people who don't share in the fundamental notions of equality, of individual freedom, of individual rights. I mean, basically the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. I mean, if you don't, who doesn't buy into that? Well, it's the extremes of both the left and the right.
Mhm.
It's Marxists and anarchists on the left, and it's basically fascists and their ilk on the right. But the political party system revolves around this kind of this axis of classical liberalism, that I think most people probably, whether they realize it or not, because most people don't realize it, they speak that language whether they realize it or not. And all the social movements of the last 20 or 30 years, for 50 years, you know, whether it's rights for African Americans, whether it's gay rights, whatever social movement, you know, women's rights, I mean, they all speak the language of
Almost
classical liberalism
unconsciously.
unconsciously.
Right.
I mean, if you look at the success of the gay rights movement in the last 15 or 20 years, it's because it was successfully harnessed to the language of equality. And if you can successfully harness the language of equality to a particular point of view or cause, it seems to me like you have a tremendous chance of success in the United States, because at the core, this is just my thesis, so I'm curious what your response to it is.
Yep.
At the core, we all believe in equality. And so you paint and we saw this during the civil rights movement as well. You could when the civil rights leaders were able to paint the opposition into the corner of saying, well, then you must be against equality, it becomes almost unpatriotic, because equality is such a founding, it seems to be, or is accepted to be, a founding principle, at least philosophically, of who we are as a country. So it created how do you answer that? Well, yes, I am actually against equality. It almost seems un-American to say something like that. So you're rhetorically, you've been cornered, so to speak, if you know what I'm saying, or strategically. So I'm curious how you respond to that, because as I said, I've always taught that, you know, we are a classical liberal country, and that's the most powerful argument you can make, is for equality.
So my
And individual freedom.
My response to that would be as a historian, and that is a lot of the language that you're using in the understanding of equality is very much a post-World War II phenomenon. If you were to listen to people speak about the concepts of everything we've already mentioned, authority, liberty, democracy, equality, and you heard them and say, I don't know, 1890, 1910, something like that, they would be speaking and defining those terms in a different way, because the context of their lives is different. Post-World War II, and the fight against fascism, you know, the fear of the Japanese Empire and the like, had a very long-lasting effect on American consciousness and how they defined and looked at those terms. And in many ways, the fights that we're beginning to have today is the wearing off of that context, if you understand what I mean. You know, Pearl Harbor was a long time ago, and now we're sort of getting past it. And so contests over the definition of people are reemerging. 40 years ago, we might not have had this type of conversation, because we were still well within that Cold War conflict, post-World War II Cold War context. We're now emerging from the other side of that. And what are we asking? We're asking fundamental questions about democracy, liberty, authority, all this type of things that we wouldn't have asked before, because just like, you know, the age of the American Revolution passed and different questions were asked. The age of the Civil War began to pass and different questions were asked. We're now beginning to get past the post-World War II era, and that's beginning to wear off, and fundamental questions are being asked again.
So has a window of opportunity open for Jacobitism again?
And here is the great opportunity for Jacobites to sneak right in. No, but if you understand what I'm saying, and that in some ways informs what I'm trying to do.
So ideologically, you're saying we're becoming more diverse as a society than we have
Absolutely.
been in the last 70 years.
Because the pressures of that post-World War II context are beginning to lift. Cold War obviously lifted quite a long time ago. And so with that lid being lifted off, fundamental questions are being asked. And to bring it back home, these Jacobites were doing as well in the sort of disorder of the late 19th century, asking questions about, is this really working?
Right. Yeah, I could go on, but I want to make sure everyone else gets an opportunity as well. So I think we can take questions both from the live audience here in person, I should say, as well as from Zoom. So we actually have a question there in the chat.
You want to read it?
Do you think democracy was an unfulfilled promise because they saw the value of a person's vote with Oh, it got moved on me. Did they think democracy was an unfulfilled promise? I think meaning the Jacobites, because they saw the value of a person's vote with the current population to be diminished, or that as the population increases, the importance of a person's vote would be diminished.
That actually is a criticism, a classical criticism of democracy that Jacobites bring up, sort of irony of democracy, that with extending the suffrage to more people, on the one hand, it's empowering, it's inclusive, but with more and more people brought into the system, the significance of an individual vote begins to shrink. If you, just as a mathematical.
So so they definitely believe there should be certain qualifications for the suffrage. right?
Absolutely.
Which would be what? Property
Qualifications would be one. Yes, property qualifications. They don't generally tend to speak of religious qualifications for office. You have to be Anglo-Catholic or something like that. But property qualifications, certainly. They don't think that the broadening of the suffrage has led to better government. It's led to worse government. In many ways, what they're trying to argue for, I'll put it differently. They're inspired by the past as opposed to trying to recreate the past. That was a distinction that Ralph Adams Cram made. I'm not trying to bring back 1600, but we can be inspired by the past to create new institutions along the precedent of earlier models. And so in some ways, these Jacobites are trying to bring about almost a neo-feudal socialism, small s, in what they're criticizing, what they're proposing, because they are anti-capitalist.
Did any of them ever comment on women's suffrage, or was it a little too early for that to enter there?
There's not a wide commentary on women's suffrage. Cram was opposed to women's suffrage. He was opposed to the direct election of senators. A lot of the sort of what we would call the liberalization of the Constitution, not particularly keen on that at all. But it didn't get wide comment from the Jacobites. No, they had other things more directly in their sights.
Right.
Some of those being, Parliament was crooked and it's filled with oligarchs, and we need to roll this type of thing back. Is there another one?
I have a question. What concrete vision of society did the Jacobites have when it comes to the economy, the social system, and the political system? And their vision in the 1880s, was that influenced by wasn't the Second Reform Act in the 1880s? And then wasn't that Oxford movement in Anglicanism in the 1880s with Cardinal Newman? Was it, so what sort of a vision for society did they have? And is there any relevance of that vision to our society and the conservatives today?
So there was a Reform Act in 84, 85. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the Order of the White Rose was formed almost exactly thereafter. And they're seeing the extension of the suffrage as not curing the disease, but actually adding to it. They were part of the Jacobite movement on both sides of the Atlantic, were part of a much broader anti-modern movement, right? At the time, which you can fold in John Ruskin, you can fold in William Morris, the arts and crafts movement, Gustav Stickney, Henry Adams, Imogene Guiney in her poetry, the sort of fixation on all things medieval at the end of the 19th century, because they were inspired by feudal Europe. They thought that was in many ways a model, not to recreate, but to be inspired to create new institutions, because those institutions have long since decayed, is a model to create new institutions inspired by that example, if that makes sense.
They were romantic.
Definitely part of the Romantic movement. There's no question that they emerge out of that Romantic movement in their criticisms. Yeah. And what was the last part of that? I'm sorry.
Well, concretely, what part of the economy did they?
Oh.
Did they want to deindustrialize Britain? What sort of social system did they want? And then exactly, well, political system would be a monarchy, of course.
Right, an empowered monarchy, so that the monarch would actually have more authority than in the aristocracy, more than they did before. They seem to be inspired by they don't speak directly to deindustrialization, but you do see an emphasis that, what has suffered over the 19th century, the economy of the countryside, the village economy of the countryside, and that should be used as more of a model. Some of these Jacobites will move into what's called distributism by the 1920s and 1930s, which was a Catholic-inspired social and economic school, most identified with people like G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, people like that, if you know them in the 20s and 30s. So, it's attempting to use the model of a sort of communitarian village economy as a model for how to arrange a more just economic system. So as opposed to economies of scale in urban settings, put the emphasis upon economic exchange in families, between families, neighborhoods, villages, and the like. They don't speak directly to deindustrialism, nothing that explicit, but much of what they say is inspired by Catholic economic and social thought coming down from medieval Europe. How can this inspire us to create a different, more just economic and political system? Yeah. Well, it's just what I was just saying with Dr. Swarts. You do, as the sort of lid is coming off in some ways, the context of the post-World War II world is coming off. You begin to hear these type of things being mentioned again. You begin to hear Chester Belloc, as they're always called together. But distributism, you begin to hear that mentioned more often. There's a big emphasis right now on things like common good constitutionalism, as opposed to originalist theories, things like that. So, and again, that's one of the things that sort of inspired me to write about the book, because some of the things that they say, you can begin to see the outline of some of those criticisms in language coming up again today.
Hammond has a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Again,
Okay, perfect. So when did the Jacobites start get to like their peak in Britain, and when did they like start to fall off?
so the peak membership, the peak influence of them is in the 1890s, really about 1895, somewhere around there. As far as membership goes, I think I mentioned it before, across the various Jacobite societies, I mean, I think 2,000 would be a real high number, probably a little bit below that. Jacobitism in the UK has a longer life than Jacobitism in the US. In the UK, it fades slowly after 1900 and then finally comes to an end with World War I, because in the Jacobite, I didn't talk about this, but in the Jacobite succession, at the time we're speaking of, the time of Queen Victoria, the Jacobites would say the legitimate Queen of England was Mary of Bavaria, because her title, her right to the throne, descends from Charles I's daughter, Henrietta. And so the throne rightly belongs to her. Her son, well, I guess would be the de jure Prince of Wales, was Prince Rupert or Prince Ruprecht. In World War I, he was a general in charge of an entire section of the Western Front. And the troops opposite him on the other side of the trenches just happened to be British. And so you have the de jure, Mary was still alive at that point, but he would be the de jure Prince of Wales, the heir to the British throne.
Yeah.
His subjects are on the other side of the trench. I think you'd agree that it makes the Jacobite succession relatively awkward at that point. And so Jacobitism takes a hit in World War I. And it's after the war, you see bits of it coming back even today. In the United States, it fades pretty quickly after 1900. Ralph Adams Cram began to lose business. He was an architect, very famous architect in the country. He began to lose business because apparently some people who considered hiring him to design buildings said, "Aren't you the guy who's in charge of the White Rose and Jacobite?" And he started to potentially lose money. And so that began to take a back seat. And some of the leaders, one pastor died. Another famous Jacobite converted to the Catholic Church. He was a priest, converted to the Catholic Church. And then sort of became an art expert and faded away. So the leadership begins to fade away as well. Jacobitism in the US ceases to be a factor by about 1905. It loses steam.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
You started this project about 5 years ago, correct?
Thereabouts.
You did most of your work on this project during the pandemic. Could you talk a little bit about your research process and how you developed this project? Yeah, how did you do the history?
The mechanics of it in some ways. Well, as I said at the very beginning of Van Wyck Brooks, I saw these mention of it in this book, and I'd never heard of it before. And I went searching, and I'm pretty good with New England history, right? I deal with that's one of the things I write on, and I had never heard of this Jacobite movement in, of all places, Boston. And in Van Wyck Brooks' book, did I mention this at the beginning? I thought, did I mention
No.
Brooks? Oh, did I not? Okay, so I'll go back. About 5 or 6 years ago, I was reading through a great book. I recommend everyone to read it. A 2-volume set by a man named Van Wyck Brooks. And it's a history like New England literature and culture. I'm the prime reader for this.
Not a niche topic at all for a New England,
It should be republished. It's a brilliant book, yeah. But the second volume of it is called New England Indian Summer, and it deals with arts and letters. It's brilliant, witty book, really well written. It's New England culture and letters after 1865, after the Civil War, and it has a chapter called and you can tell me if I'm pronouncing this wrong, the Epigony, Epigoni.
yes, I don't know how it would be pronounced in modern
It's
English.
Greek.
Yeah, it's Greek.
I think it's the Epigony, which means like children or
Yeah,
offspring. I
like
think that's
that,
what it
yeah.
means. And it's a chapter about New England writers in the 1890s. And it was called Epigony, apparently, because this is the new generation. The Emersonian generation is dying off. And the Emersonian generation are all these sunny people, how, oh, individuals are great. And the United States has such promise, and they're all very happy. This new generation, now that the Emersonians are dying off, are the exact opposite. They're young and gloomy and pessimistic about the US and what's going on. And one of them is Ralph Adams Cram. And I read in this book, it says there was this group of Jacobites in Boston, and they're toasting monarchy. And I thought, I've never heard of this before. Who are these people? And I went looking for information, couldn't find it. And
So it's very serendipitous then. You just,
the book came about by simple curiosity. I just was like, well, who are these people? And I started doing research, didn't find the answers that anybody else had written, at least not enough depth. And so I started putting it together. I started doing research. Usually when you begin projects like this, you begin with just factual basis. So I was looking at newspapers. I just wanted to know names, dates. You tell me who's where and things like that. And then pretty soon I was able to locate some manuscript collections as well. In Canada, one of the American Jacobites comes down from Canada. So there were a couple of collections there I was able to plug into. And excuse me, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, because one of these ex-Jacobites goes to the Met, losing my voice. And they had a big personnel file on him there. And apparently the people who worked with him in the 20s and 30s had no idea he was the most, this big Jacobite in New York, 30 years previous. But they had this wonderful personnel file on him. And they graciously sent me some of them, of the correspondence that was in there. And I was able to put together the story. So it began with me just trying to satisfy some curiosity. And then at a certain point I said, this is a pretty interesting story. I could probably put this together into a book. And
am I right that this seems to be the first kind of analysis of this period, this topic in this period, right? Because I didn't really pick up in reading on a lot of other secondary sources that you consulted that had really been about this period.
it's been touched on.
Right, but
here
not
and
into
there,
this
not
extent.
on a book length treatment.
Right.
It's been touched on here and there. A lot of times with literary and cultural historians, I was interested in some of the politics of it.
Mhm.
But so this is the first big
That's great.
book length
Yeah.
treatment of it. One last thing, because before we run out of time, and I say this in the beginning of the book, I had one of the most satisfying research experiences in writing the book, because one of these Jacobites, who I haven't mentioned yet, was Robert Thomas Nicol. He's this Canadian Anglican priest who comes down, goes to New York City, leaves the Anglican Episcopalian Church, and then goes to work at the Met. And I was trying, and nobody knows who he is. He's completely invisible. And I'm trying to track him down. I know he died in 1937, and I'm like, well, where is he buried? And I knew he was buried in Portsmouth. There's a lot of Portsmouths around. What Portsmouth? Portsmouth, New Hampshire,
Right.
Portsmouth, Rhode Island, Portsmouth, Virginia. And I was able to narrow it down, like, I think it's Portsmouth, New Hampshire, because a good friend of his had a seaside farm called Creek Farm, and he loved it very much. And I believe he was buried there. And you can't find anything that mentions it or shows a picture or anything like that. So I contacted the Portsmouth Athenaeum, and the director wrote me back, and I said, hey, look, I've got this guy, I think he's buried over at Creek Farm. But can you tell me, do you know? And he wrote me back and said, I have no idea. He said, but I know the next door neighbor to the farm. So I'll call her up and she'll walk over with her phone. She'll walk over with her cell phone. And if there's the graveyard there, she'll take a picture of it and I'll send it to you. I'm like, this is fantastic. This doesn't happen. So sure enough, 2 days later, he says, yep, graveyard is there. There are 3 stones. It's sort of tucked up amongst the trees. And there's Robert Thomas Nicol, this big slate stone. Apparently he had designed himself, all in Latin, because he was a classics teacher. Here lies a sinner, Robert Thomas Nicol, you know, what have you. And it was really, I was like, so satisfying to be able to track something like that down. And it was poignant too, because in one of the letters from the Met, it talks about his friends are writing saying, the funeral was held in Manhattan and we escorted the body casket to Portsmouth. And we had a very small ceremony. We got a local priest to come over and consecrate the ground, and a local farmer helped us dig the grave. And we lined the grave with pine needles. And we lowered the casket in, black cross on it, and we held a little service. And he said it was all very beautiful and simple, just as he would have liked it. And the picture that I get, the whole scene is covered with pine needles. So it's still there, you know, it's still this very poignant, you know, how many years later, 1937. So, you know, almost 90 years later, something like that. It was still there. Like, as a research moment, that was so satisfying.
Are you planning a trip to check it out in person?
I don't know if it's on private property.
Oh, okay. We have a question online. Can you read it, Michael?
I can read it for you.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
please.
Were there any beliefs of the Jacobites that were less radical and may have laid roots for other more commonly held beliefs in the United States?
Well, one of the things that's interesting, in a general sense, one of the things that's interesting is that American Jacobites were arguing for a more powerful presidency, and they saw the foundation in Hamilton's works. They saw the foundations were there for the building of a much more powerful presidency. And of course, right as the Jacobites in the US are starting to fade, would you have Teddy Roosevelt, who is really building upon the potential of presidential power. So they did see and were very anxious for it. And by the way, Cram loves Roosevelt, loves Franklin Roosevelt too. He looked at the New Deal and said, oh, Franklin Roosevelt's like an American monarch. He loved him. They sort of perceived the potential of the presidency as being something very powerful and useful to achieve their vision, if you will.
So you think they would have been happy with the so-called imperial presidency that we've seen in the last 50 years or so, even though it has taken us in an ideological direction that you would think people on the right wouldn't be crazy about?
Yeah, they might not like the details of what some of the presidents did with that imperial presidency, but door swings both ways. I mean, when in the hands of the right person, the imperial presidency might be able to do a lot of good for what the Jacobites were aiming for.
Right.
So they would have been, I think, pleased with that. It'd be an extension to say they laid the groundwork for it. That wasn't the case.
Right.
That they would have been particularly pleased at that. And even some of the stuff that we talked about, I talked about in the book, like the post-liberalism, I think some of them would have looked at that and said, well, yes, you should be criticizing things like what a global economic system has done to the people who are left out and things like that, you know, because that sort of echoes what they were saying about the industrial system in the 1890s. Yeah, so there's some things I think they would have felt justified in some ways.
Do we have any more online or?
We've got one here.
Oh, okay.
So I was curious, are there any like prominent Jacobites in like Canada or Australia or South Africa, anywhere in the colonies at this time?
It's a good question. They don't show up in the sources. I suspect there is a stronger Jacobite movement in Canada than I was able to find. I was able to sort of locate a few little blips here and there, but it may be a lack of sources, or I really have to spend a lot of time in Canada. There may be more of a Canadian Jacobite movement than I'm currently aware of. As far as other areas in the empire, you don't see it mentioned. You don't see something like that mentioned. So it could be. It's certainly possible. It wouldn't surprise me to find an Australian Jacobite movement at all. You'd be a better example. You know Australia better than I do. It wouldn't surprise me to find that type of thing. I'm sure lots of Jacobites were in the 18th century were exiled to Australia. I don't know.
It'd be a great question to look into. I
Yeah.
mean, again, I go back to what I was kind of thinking earlier, which is that it just seems like the trend of history in recent years is just going in the other direction, which you see the growth of republicanism in so many places. And for those that don't know, republicanism in this context means moving away from monarchy to a country with it not being a monarchy. So you see that in Australia, for instance. Wouldn't surprise me if Australia becomes a republic in the next 5 or 10 years. So it would seem to be moving in the opposite direction. But again, as we've talked about, it never was a mass movement to begin with. In fact, quite the opposite.
No, it was an elite movement with three major factions: clerics, Anglo-Catholic and Catholic, Roman Catholic clerics, some members of the aristocracy, and artists generally. I'll put that in an umbrella, sculptors, painters, writers, poets, architects, things like that. Cultural creators, I hate that phrase, but it's something, it gets to what they were. In the United States, you don't have the aristocracy, but it was very much clerics and artists and things like that who were Jacobites. Yeah.
Do we
Okay.
have one more? One more? Okay.
So could you say that there are some versions of what the Jacobites were pushing in terms of like their view of liberty that kind of made a resurgence in, say, the 1980s with the Reaganite movement? Their view of liberty in the sense that without virtue, it's just essentially hedonic pleasure in that way.
Yeah, I don't know how would Jacobites react? It's kind of tough. How would Jacobites react to Ronald Reagan? The Reagan Revolution was a market revolution. It was a supply side market revolution, and Jacobites would not have been particularly comfortable with that. They had a lot of, they would probably very generally, if we really broaden the definition, be described as conservatives, right? They might have problems with that, but if we make it in the most broad definition as possible, they could be described as conservatives, but they weren't free market conservatives. They weren't liberals, small L, right liberals, in seeing that the market was the answer to human happiness, was the answer to problems. In many ways for them in the late 19th century, it was the source of problems. So they were anti-capitalist conservatives, and there are such people, real Tories, if you will, from that Tory tradition as opposed to a more liberal Whig tradition. Which is why, coming back to an earlier question, some of the foundation of their economic thought, for example, comes from sort of Catholic social and economic thought, which is not roaringly pro-market. It has this more emphasis upon virtue, yes, but virtue in the common good, as opposed to that sort of individualism, market-focused values, if that makes sense. So they'd have, I think, a lot of problems with that.
And someone like Margaret Thatcher in Britain just totally was
Margaret Thatcher was a
diametrically
liberal.
opposed to the
Yep.
kind of high Tory tradition that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Just hated those people.
Yeah, they
Saw them as elitists, which
were.
they were.
Yeah. Elitist is not a pejorative in Jacobite term. Of course, elites are natural. The hierarchies happen everywhere. Even in the most socialistic country in the world, you're going to have hierarchies and elites. Get used to it. So if elites are inevitable, then let's make sure we have a really good one instead of a really corrupt one, right? So they would have had no use for a liberal, like small L, liberal like Thatcher, listening to Friedrich Hayek and people like that. They were old-fashioned Tories, as I say in the book, Tory revolutionaries, because they were trying to trying for a Toryism that was different than the Toryism that was beginning to emerge at the time, which is sort of a liberal, tinted by liberalism and advocacy of industrialism and things like that.
Okay, last question to Hammond.
So you were talking about the Jacobites and how they view democracy and things like that, and how they want monarchs and presidents to have more power. How do they make the distinction of the checks and balances between that and like a dictatorship? Like it seems to blur the line a little bit.
You know, I'll use it in the American context because the checks and balances, it's really easier to speak of it in that context. The Cram, you don't get the sense of Cram being particularly hung up with checks and balances. Yes, you're always going to have, in an American constitutional system, you're going to have 3 branches of government. But what you have now, and I'll have my Cram hat on as I talk about this, what you have now is an imbalance. The authority is too much with the power of Congress, and British Jacobites would have said the same thing. All the authorities with Parliament, and the proof of the pudding's in the eating. Look around you, you don't see a just social and political system. You see a rotten one. Just look at America, just look at American and British cities, and so on. But they weren't particularly focused in on the balance of powers. You know, it's funny. You bring up dictatorship. After Jacobitism declines and disappears, the Jacobites go in all kinds of different directions, some of which I've already talked about. You know, Father Nichol, who I just spoke of, buried in Portsmouth, goes in the direction of Chesterton and Belloc and distributism. Apparently, he was very friendly with people like Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement and things like that. Cram becomes an advocate of the Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. Herbert Vivian, who is a very prominent British Jacobite and a travel writer, fascinating fellow, who traveled around Italy when it was still a parliamentary Republican state and hated it, is a great admirer of Mussolini. Thinks that Mussolini has rescued Italy from the corruptions of its parliamentary days, and believes that Mussolini at some point in the future will restore the monarchy, restore the Italian monarchy, step down and disappear. That's his what his great services is going to be. Now, of course, we know it didn't happen that way, but he was a great advocate of and fan of Il Duce. And you get the sense that when he's writing all that, he's in the back of his mind thinking of Britain too.
But not Hitler.
But not hated Hitler.
Yeah.
He thought Hitler was a fraud and was unintelligent and was essentially duping young Germans in miserable situations to advocate a genuine dictatorship. He thought that Mussolini was much more acceptable. Not because Vivian was a committed fascist so much as that he saw that after Mussolini, you would get the monarchy back, and perhaps something like that can happen in Great Britain too. That you could roll back 1688, that it didn't have to be so, that you could get back to a Stuart monarchy with real authority that would rule justly as opposed to an unjust parliament.
Well, we're getting the hook, Professor Connolly. So thanks very much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I really enjoyed the book. If you haven't had an opportunity, I think, does the QR code lead to
On sale at fine booksellers everywhere.
everywhere and at McGill Queen's University Press? I don't think we mentioned the press.
McGill
so-
Queen's University Press, yes.
So you get a 30% discount if you have the MQSB code.
Yeah, so
Okay. Through McGill Queen's University Press. So I would definitely recommend get a copy of it. I think you'll really enjoy it. Not being a historian myself, it's always great when you basically read about a topic that you don't know anything about and you feel like you've learned something in the process. I really enjoyed it. So thanks to everybody who came out. Thanks, Professor Connolly, for a great conversation. I've had a great time, and thanks very much.
thank you.